Hello, everyone. I'm Adrian Sanabria. Welcome to this webcast sponsored by Mighty ID. Joining me is a panel of folks today. We have with us Chris Steinke, CEO of Mighty ID. Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm well, and I'm this. I wish I was the CEO. I'm the COO.
Yeah, COO. Sorry if
You
that wasn't
promoted me.
clear.
That's great. I'm happy to take the promotion today.
All right. Also with us, we've got Ben Dimmick, Director of Security Consulting Services at Tavora. Hello, Ben. How are you?
I'm well, Adrian. Thank you for having me.
Next, we've got Jeff Rich, Executive Director, Identity Defined Security Alliance. How are you, Jeff?
Hello, Adrian. I'm doing really well, thanks. And I'm really glad to be here.
Glad to have you. And finally, last but not least, Michael Farnham, Advisory CISO at Trace3. How are you, Jeff?
Yeah, that's okay. You got a lot of people on here, Adrian. I'm good. Thank you. I think I have the least fancy title of anybody on here. So I think we've got a good team going.
Yeah, I mean, titles are, they don't tell the full story. They never do. All right. So today we are going to discuss identity resilience, the missing piece to securing your identities. And really interesting conversation today. I've been having a lot of conversations that involve the word resilience. We'll get to that. We'll define what we mean by that. And so some quick housekeeping. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A button below, and there's also a chat button below. We'll be checking both of these as we go through this webinar. So if you have any questions, feel free to just drop them in there anytime. We can maybe pull them into the conversation. Sometimes it's better to answer the questions while we're having that conversation and not wait till the very end. Or if you want to wait till the very end, I can't guarantee we're going to have time for everyone's questions. You could just put them in then as well. All right. So kicking us off here, just to start, let's talk about identity resilience. As I mentioned, we've been hearing that a lot. I think just to give some background here, the security industry has been was very focused on prevention for a long time. We've kind of seen this cycle back and forth where, we spend maybe too much time on prevention and then we don't see attacks when they happen. And they say, oh, we got to work on detection and response. And so we focus on that a little bit. And now, as it seems almost everybody's been through a breach, every major company at this point, now we're talking a lot about recovery and resilience and like how quickly can we bounce back from it? How well can we handle it? How can we minimize the damages when these things occur? So, who wants to start us off and kind of define identity resilience for us? Maybe you, Chris?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. Identity resilience, it's like what you said. People are talking more and more about the term resilience. And in my past history, leading infrastructure and operations teams, resilience was a key tenet in how we operated. You had to have the ability to absorb, bounce back, recover from things quickly, work at degraded states. It was just the nature of how you needed to operate. And from a security standpoint, when we talk about resilience, it is that organization's ability to not only protect and manage their digital identities, but be able to absorb and recover and operate at degraded states when necessary. It's like what you said. It's not a matter of if, but when an attack happens. And companies are starting to look at what do they need to do to be able to assume breach instead of just always preventing for a breach. And if you're building your environment and following a model like zero trust or what have you, the concept of assuming a breach means you have to build resiliency in your plans and your environments and so forth. So that's kind of what it means to me from what does resilience mean in the world of identity management.
Yeah. Anyone want to add to that? I'll add a little bit in that. I think it is kind of a mark of maturity, both in the industry where we are in the industry, and for individual companies as well, to be able to kind of think at this level and plan at this level.
Yeah, if I could jump in here,
one of the pushes we've seen for years and years has been trying to get more assets and systems behind single sign-on, making single sign-on that one point of access for all of your authentication functionality, and that's been a big boon from a security perspective. It's really helped to reduce risk by allowing us to do things like apply MFA globally and so on and so forth. The challenge comes in that in many cases, we get locked into a state of where there's a single point of failure now, because we have this one gate to everything. If that gate gets slammed shut for some reason, then we're having a rough time. And so that's where a lot of these identity resilience conversations came up. Initially, there was a lot of our clients, we're a consulting company, that came in and really wanted to move to the cloud for this reason. Generally speaking, cloud providers tend to have better SLAs and availability metrics than most companies that are hosting their systems themselves. And so the thought was that the resilience issue would be much easier within the cloud. And while I'm not suggesting that's not the case, I think in a lot of cases it caused a lot of conversations to stop at that point and say, that's it, we've got it figured out. Our identity provider is now handling this for us. We don't have to worry about it. But we're finding a lot of organizations that are figuring out that's not necessarily the case. As we've had conversations with clients, we find that most of them go into one of two categories. The first one, they either get this right away and they definitely want to discuss it, or in some cases they have that aha moment coming where suddenly they, as we're beginning to talk through why this comes up, why this becomes an issue, how there's internal and external factors that both come into play here. Suddenly, we see the light bulb come on, and they start to realize why we do need to talk about this and what this really looks like for them overall.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say it's a great point because I read a recent study that 1 in 3 companies are have identity protection as their top priority. And protection sounds like it's, a preventative control or approach only, but it really takes in the whole aspect of how are you protecting the infrastructure, how are you protecting the services, how are you protecting everything, not just from some type of attack or, an availability moment, but also from an integrity moment, also from a business continuity moment. Because really, when we think about it, identities are not just something that you log in with and get access with. Identities are what, how business gets done today are through identities. So you have to think about the resiliency of your identity systems and what are you doing to make sure that not only are they available, but you can recover, you can have the flexibility that you need with them.
Yeah, pretty critical systems. And after this webcast, I'm doing my podcast, Enterprise Security Weekly, and one of the key topics we're going to talk about is all around identity. It's the Snowflake breach, but of course, Snowflake didn't actually have a breach directly. So we're going to have a conversation about that shared responsibility model. And it's funny. A friend of mine, Rich Mogul, on the Securosis website, just blogged about a KPI he says we can use: the time or data volume before a cloud provider requires MFA on all administrative controls. So, to some extent, we see these cloud providers changing their services because they're like, okay, we thought we could give you the choice as to whether or not you want to use MFA, but it's becoming too much trouble for us, so we're going to force it on you.
Now, if I can, Adrian, real briefly, there's been good discussion so far on how to get it done and methods to get there. What a lot of people I think aren't on yet are the metrics around it. And I'm not saying I have the KPI specifically, but the definition I like to use is the ability to have an identity with capabilities that can persist without compromise. And if you consider saying that's the bar you need to jump over, now you can start looking at what tools, what methodologies, what processes, and what recovery methods are going to help get you there.
Yeah, for sure. And on that topic, Chris, I'm going to jump back to you. Why is it so essential to incorporate response strategies into identity resilience? We were just talking about prevention. Why is that so important here?
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit in the opening question around the the concept of assumed breach, right? And everyone's very focused on prevention, but a response mechanism isn't just about incident response. It's that resiliency point of being able to absorb, operate integrated, or be able to avoid an issue. Even though no one wants to hear it, security breaches are not a matter of if but when. I said that earlier, and coupled with resiliency planning, it prepares you not only for the prevention but that ability to absorb and recover. The zero trust framework, a lot of people are very familiar with that. It's kind of like trust no one, and it's all about the core of it is about access. And so many people are using and organizations are using this framework. It's a great framework for building a modern and effective cyber program. But if you aren't looking at how do I make what I implement in that framework, not only just trustworthy, but also being able to have something where you can recover from something, you can have your backups, have your the ability to fail over on these types of identity systems are very, very key. And Ben was talking about customers that are starting to see things differently, and the comments made earlier about that you made about the maturity of things. We are starting to see different customers look at this as hey, we need to take our identity environment and make it something that can absorb, or we can shift and avoid out of a situation, or we can fail over, or we can completely eliminate tech debt and move out of it. And that's all part of creating a resilient environment. So the question to ask yourself in this type of situation around is my strategy resilient, is what would we do if our identity services or capabilities were breached, unavailable, or corrupt? And so that's how you start to plan your resiliency.
Right. And I imagine you maybe do some tabletops. You maybe use some examples, use some actual scenarios that have happened. Like if this happened to us, what would we need in place to handle this more eloquently than maybe what would happen today, right?
Right. I mean, the controls that you can build around the planning of tabletops, but also more operational and active state capabilities that can respond in real time, that can prepare you in real time, is what I'm talking about. I'll actually defer to Ben a little bit around some of the ways that they've helped from a services. Tavor is one of our partners, and helped customers from a services perspective get themselves in a more resilient state. Whether it's working with us or just helping them build the right practices.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. And to that point, MindID has really been a linchpin for so many of our clients. What it really comes down to in a lot of cases is not just the security component to it, but also the availability component. For instance, if the perception within your organization is that single sign-on has issues, there's issues where it may not be available at certain times, and so on and so forth. Users are much more likely to go seeking backdoors or looking for ways to enable backdoors, which ultimately erodes security from that perspective. So having that capability to proactively get these issues addressed has really been a huge thing. To that end, I guess that's been a significant part of the whole response strategy as well, is how do we know that a problem has happened? For a lot of organizations, they know a problem happens because help desk tickets start piling up, which is a very reactive approach as opposed to taking a more proactive approach. And so that's why, generally speaking, we're looking heavily at things like how are we really monitoring what's happening within the organization? How are we monitoring what's going on, whether it's things like failed login attempts, or user provisioning changes that are suddenly happening that weren't expected previously, things along those lines. These can all be strong indications that there's a problem, and really helps to add an extra 9 or 2 to the overall SLAs of the identity program on the whole. It is one of the challenges with identity. I'm sure I don't need to tell most of you that it's not just an IT or security initiative. It's really a whole organization initiative, and so being able to really show that the whole program is being managed well and it's in good hands has been a huge thing that we've been hearing from clients, that they really have to ensure that the system looks solid, looks bulletproof, that there's no problems where, well, rather, if problems do occur, they're being discovered and remediated before users are even aware of them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we already have a question in here. How to put resilience in place in front of MFA that is not costly to an organization. So I think there's a couple of different ways to read this, but I'm put resilience in place in front of MFA. Does that make sense to anybody right off the bat? I'm trying to do a little translation here.
The resilience to me, just in general before MFA, just has to do with being able to have something that's automatically going to be recoverable and resilient I think that's why a lot of people have moved into with cloud providers, and when they're doing any kind of digital transformation, it almost comes somewhat, I think we discussed at the beginning, it's not the panacea, it's not the end all be all, but you have some ability to recover automatically via a cloud provider, identity and access management, versus having something that's on-prem. I think that's resiliency before 2FA, immediately being able to just recover from some kind of unanticipated attack, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I'm sorry, I was jumping in there. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I presume the cost is referencing maybe having to manually build some tooling or some scripting or something like that to help with that resilience, to maybe switch over to a backup or, another region, or however you're handling resilience. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, there are things you could do with, load balancing and scripting and things like that to help, direct, but you're really generally moving within the same, provider capability. And like Mike said, moving to the cloud has provided companies with some innate resiliency, or, at least some what you might say, being available everywhere type of thing. But what they don't always recognize is that these things aren't being backed up. The provider doesn't back up your configuration. They provide you with a bucket to put your configuration in, but what's in that bucket isn't backed up. And so that's what companies, and Ben was touching on it earlier, where the ones that we're helping have recognized that fact that they have this exposure. And right. Although you can build as much resiliency, you can do things before the MFA to give yourself the greatest amount of flexibility and multiple paths and balancing across, your provider, how you've configured, and all the important stuff behind the scenes is still a single point of failure right behind that.
Yeah, I love that point, because a lot of times, even if they are providing some kind of backup, it's backup of the user database itself only, not the configurations, not the policies that are in place. All of that's stuff things that people don't think about from an importance standpoint, but it's absolutely needed if you're going to recover. Because if all you have is your users, then all of a sudden they just have complete access to everything on the next side, because you kind of want to fail open. It's just not a good state to be in.
Yeah, our customers mostly, when they spoke to us about this, it's they're concerned about those more, what I would call, complex configuration sets, things around how the applications and attributes and things like that are being maintained and saved and backed up, because that's the thing that takes time to build. You can pull up all the users another way through Active Directory or something like that, but it's all those other details that are being left kind of in a single point of failure state. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, back when I used to do disaster recovery and business continuity work, I'd say if you haven't actually run the plan, then you've maybe thought of 50% of what might go wrong or what you need in place for it to go smoothly, right?
I do remember greatly struggling in a SunGuard facility several years ago with all my tape backups and wondering why my users didn't have access to any of the files that it was because Active Directory was not recovering like it should recover. So absolutely.
A lot of us have SunGuard related, not that it was SunGuard's fault, but a lot of us have trauma in our past where SunGuard was the location where it happened.
Actually, you bring up a very good point around that really drives us home. SunGuard provided good services, and I'm not here either promoting them or not. But there was always an assumption, I have a backup, it's going to work. Yeah. Well, you might want to see if it does.
It's not their fault you didn't have your stuff together.
Nope.
You didn't have a good plan. They just provided the facility and some of the equipment, right?
Or you didn't test your plan appropriately, right?
Right. Yeah,
I feel seen right now.
We've all been there. Don't worry about that, Mike. Ben, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly. I kind of touched on before the idea of internal and external threats, and that's also a kind of a big thing of when it comes to identity resilience. That's been coming up in a lot of conversations. You normally have to worry about both of those types of issues, and it's difficult to really, or for I guess I'd say systems in the past to be able to account for both of them. So for instance, when it comes to internal things, it could be something like somebody screwed up a configuration, we need to roll it back, or somebody wrote a script, went really bad, and now everyone's last name is Smith. And there's lots of things that can go wrong there just internally that can cause those things to happen. And really no cloud provider is going to protect you from that. That's where a lot of the joint responsibility models come in. On the other hand as well is the external threats. So looking at, for instance, cloud identity providers, what happens if they're having the worst week ever and their service has been offline for 3 or 4 days? We've heard of examples of that sort of thing happening in the not too distant past. Being able to have that strategy for what are we doing? What's our escape strategy to get out and take an alternate approach instead? And so I'd say that's really where a lot of these identity resilience conversations generally will stem from is really being able to speak to those two components. And so I think to kind of the original question, it's not necessarily that we're advocating for avoiding MFA. In fact, very much the opposite. We're just looking for additional ways to ensure that we're not introducing new risks to the organization along the way.
Right. Yeah, and talking about disaster recovery, we've talked about some of the different teams that might be involved here: security, identity, IT. Maybe Ben, tell me a little bit about the importance. I presume, particularly from your point, you have to make sure the right stakeholders are involved when doing projects, and just the importance of having those connections, those ties between the different teams that need to talk to each other to be successful. And then maybe Jeff and Michael have some war stories or thoughts that they can share after that.
Sure. So I think probably one of the most on the nose examples I can give a little bit here is when we had a couple of early conversations about this topic, we would talk to the identity folks about something like what's your identity resilience strategy? How are you planning around BCP and DR and so on? And the response that we would get back was something along the lines of, "Oh, that's not our responsibility. That goes to infrastructure." Speaking to infrastructure, we would talk to them, and they would say, "Oh, that's not us. That's a security conversation." And then they'd quickly loop us back to identity once we got to the security team. So that's part of it, is just being able to have enough conversations with enough people so that to really find out who's really taking responsibility for the matter overall. There's a good chance that nobody is just yet, and that's been some of the struggle. A lot of it as well is being able to ensure that that the processes for maintaining it are in line with other organizational standards. as technologies evolve, teams within organizations evolve and start to build out. And we're finding that in many cases, identity team is now split off from IT. They are now split off from InfoSec, and but they still have to work closely with others in order to ensure that that the risk and overall security within the organization is still properly managed along the way. So I guess that's another significant portion of it too. Is we've talked about testing. That tends to be a successful component to having those strong relationships. Is ensuring that that everybody is on board with what the whole process looks like, and that everybody is supporting in the process. If you don't have a plan documented yet, then you're hoping things go well, and your possibility to recover in a timely manner, we've found based on past experiences with clients, it drops off pretty significantly when there's simply not a plan established yet.
Any thoughts there, Jeff or Michael?
Well, you mentioned war story, and if anyone ever says you have a war story, my answer is always yes. This one is 40 years old. And to let you know, this is not a new problem because
Right.
I was at a large multinational company. I'm not going to say who. And I was responsible for security and a few other things. We own the business continuity plan. However, the operations team was responsible for doing backups, restoring them when we went through the plans, and really executing the plan as we went through tests. Well, there was an administrator that ran a script on a mainframe, because it was 40 years ago, that actually deleted every single user ID, including the system ID. And it was a situation we had never thought about. And all the backups we had were worthless because we didn't have an ID to use to apply them. So we actually had to rebuild all the systems from scratch before we could apply the backups. So what really should have been just a screw up that should have been easy to recover took us close to a week. Now, I'd like to think we're in better shape now, but don't make that assumption, because that war story is not necessarily fully dated yet.
Yeah. I mean, we saw not too long ago, maybe it was like a decade now, but GitLab deleted some data. Somebody thought they were not in prod, that they were in like a dev environment, and they live streamed the whole thing to YouTube as they tried to go through recovery. And we saw all 5 levels of backup fail. I think they were built entirely in Azure. They had never tested any of these 5 levels of backup. But one by one, over 8 hours on a live stream, you get to watch these poor souls go through each level of backup, fail, and move on to the next one.
Yeah, I think from a war story standpoint, probably just watching kind of emergency teams have to get built without the proper, we mentioned tabletop exercises before. I've been in environments where, in a couple now, where we've not done the proper tabletop exercises to reach that point. And to be fair to myself and to protect my reputation, I was not the security leader in those organizations, but did see where a lot of the business unit leaders, and you start getting out of the security teams, you start getting out of the identity teams, and there's this resiliency function affects everybody across the whole organization, from the risk teams to legal teams to whatever. And I've seen a couple of times where they just did not have the proper planning in place. And when they brought everybody together to build from an emergency response team, and everybody just kind of to what the conversation was earlier, they just kept pointing fingers to the other people, saying that's their responsibility. Yeah. That's their responsibility. And it takes, when you get into that mode, and what I saw in both instances was you required a kind of a person to step up. I call them that firefighter person, to take charge, and to have to just to make everybody kind of fall in line. And what you see on the faces, which is kind of interesting, is everybody kind of has this sense of relief that somebody's actually taking charge, and they will quickly let them do their thing and move everybody into the right buckets that they need to be in. But you can't rely on that firefighter to always step up, because that person also has to be brave enough to take that burden upon their shoulders So getting that resiliency in place would have been extremely effective in having to keep that from happening. Luckily, both times we had somebody step in and take that role, but it's just not a good thing to rely on.
Well, another thing,
that should be an assigned role, right?
The firefighter.
Well, somebody to take charge, right? And say, okay, here's what we're going to do. In incident response, you should have an incident manager, right?
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. You just don't want that to be an ad hoc role.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and one other thing is as well that this also tends to come up a lot during mergers and acquisitions. There's a lot of uncertainty during those times, whether it's a matter of there's shifts in personnel, people taking on new responsibilities, and so on and so forth. And a lot of these things can quickly slip through the cracks. And so that's where we're frequently bringing in MightyID for a number of our clients. As soon as they start talking heavily about mergers and acquisitions, is we want to ensure that they have those direct capabilities right away to get their current snapshot backed up, to ensure that they've got their data in place. And ultimately, MightyID can help them to move the configurations of data from one instance over to another. So it's not just there as a safety net, but actually as a proactive tool to hasten those migrations and mergers on the way too.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the point of making sure you have the right partnerships, making sure the right people are talking to each other, right? And that kind of dovetails us into the next question, which we've already kind of talked about. Say you're in a position, you're responsible for disaster recovery, resilience, whatever it might be, but you don't have the control to actually test the backups. You're not the person to actually make sure that this stuff is in place. What are the options available to you? What steps can you take to make sure that the organization, that other teams are as prepared as maybe your team is? Anybody? Maybe it goes back to leadership, goes up to the top, right? But
I do think to your point, we've discussed it in multiple places. It's like, but yeah, that the weakness there is how do you ensure who's going to be doing what? And that is a plan creation that has to be there. And it has to be somebody at the top that's pushing that down and making sure that everything's documented. That's what I see. We talked about all the policies and procedures that need to be backed up, as well as the identities itself. How do you ensure that's even done? What kind of policies or what kind of plan is put in place to make that happen? Who's going to make that as a requirement? If you can't push it, or if you can't actually make it happen where you're the one that's in control of it, you can at least create the awareness in the organization that it needs to happen, and then see who can take that to the next step.
Yeah, the tone has to come from the top without question, but it's going to have to be the experts that can, whether it's logistics or dealing with operations or simply the cat herder that can get all the right people in the same room at the same time to make sure that the plans can be written correctly, it's tested correctly, and adjustments are made.
Yeah, and I think there's a key word that I'm picking up is the testing part of it. Lots of people will make plans, and we joked earlier about the SunGuard trauma of, hey, I've got my backups and I've got all this stuff, but have you actually been able to practice recovery or restore things and validate that they operate, the right way or as expected? And that's one of the things that we've seen our customers use the backups and the resiliency features that we offer is to make copies of tenants and to move and shift things over and to actually test the fact that they can, be resilient in real time or near real time. I think that's really powerful, and it's certainly just focused in the identity space. But the concept of being able to know, or not even just concept, just the peace of mind of being able to know that, hey, not only are we backing up, we're recovering and we're operating immediately, right? We know this works. And so that's equally important. And I wanted to touch on just another part that's not really spelled out in here. And again, in my previous life around, leading global infrastructure and cloud teams and so forth, It's, there's this concept of technical debt, and technical debt kind of becomes the enemy of, security. It becomes the enemy of being able to, back up and recover really well. If you've got disparate old systems or things that are just kind of out there that that are not optimal, they can't be backed up, or they can't be this or that, or you've got multiple platforms kind of doing the same thing and working with applications, and you've got more than one or two different type of identity platforms out there, and you've got your different applications running on them. And it could come from a merger and acquisition, like Ben said earlier. It could just come from years and years of growth and changes. The ability to consolidate down and eliminate your tech debt, and especially in an identity space where, identities can be created and left out there. They can be sitting in multiple locations, multiple repositories. And some people, like, they, as much as everyone wants to center everything onto, Active Directory or Azure, we all know that there's always little pockets, especially, the bigger you get, there's little pockets of bespoke things here or there, or that one repository that's somewhere. And so how do you consolidate those things? How do you take your, multiple identity systems and move them into one and create them into one? And, that it's kind of like an M&A story, but it's also being able to collapse down and eliminate your technical debt that reduces your footprint from an exposure standpoint. Having those identities out there, you can apply the policies more consistently, or policies and safeguards maybe you couldn't even apply in another system. So that's another important use case that we're seeing come out of this, is testing it, but also being able to, eliminate or reduce down your tech debt, which makes your backup and recovery and your BCP, your planning and ability to execute much simpler when you can do that.
One other quick tip I'll give you for anybody that wants to work on this is at a very first level, I'd say start off figuring out exactly what the use cases are that you need to begin accounting for. Since this is a fairly new thing for most organizations, it's not necessarily something where we already have this in our back pocket. We can pull this out. There's lots of things that can go wrong that haven't necessarily been planned for. Whether it's something gets reconfigured poorly, or like I said before, there was a script that went badly, and so on and so forth, as opposed to just the more obvious ones like our cloud provider has gone offline, and we're now stuck locked out, and so on. So I'd say sit down and start to kind of formalize some of this stuff. Write it down. Get other teams involved in finding out some of the heartaches and headaches that they've been having with identity, so you can make sure that's all accounted for.
If I can, there's a growing. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to, at IDSA, every year we do a research study, and we produce a report. And we recently released ours. And the phishing wins in social engineering when it comes to identity compromise. But when it comes to what would be resilience, having orphaned accounts and having identity sprawl are the number 1 and 2 issues that organizations that responded say they have in being able to manage identities. If you can't manage your identities, you're not going to have resilient identities, because you can't even make them work in a normal situation. So there's step 1, and we sometimes skip over that. I think you just heard about the technical debt. We need to eliminate that, and until we do it, you can't manage your identities. Never mind make them resilient.
I mean, I think that's a key point to the mergers and acquisitions story that was brought up. It's a lot of people focus strictly on mergers and acquisitions. I've got a lot of customers doing a lot in M&A. It's happening a lot. You see a lot of consolidation across a lot of different environments, different industries. It's also divestitures. If somebody is spinning out another company, to your point, Jeff, that's a key area where we see orphaned accounts, because they'll split off that forest or whatever it is, pull that over to create, have the other company come into existence, but a lot of those accounts don't necessarily disappear. They stay within that organization. So now they've got a lot of accounts that could have access to all levels of things, and that's just an area that is ripe for having compromised identities that you didn't know were there in the first place, or you thought were in that other domain and were gone. So definitely a big thing to worry about in what we call MAD, not just M&A, mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures.
And divestitures. Yeah, nice.
It's a hard word to say, by the way. Divestitures.
Divestitures, yeah.
Yeah, and it certainly can drive you mad.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's more terrifying, though, than disabling or removing accounts when you have no idea what will happen when you do it, right? You know, like I can understand why some of these issues stay out there, right? Like, you know, service account, it's been there forever. You don't know what it does. You know, like you need some observability there, too. You need some logging. You need some, you know, some way to go research that and say, okay, you know, what are the chances we can turn this off and I'm not going to get fired for doing it?
I mean, where's your sense of adventure, Adrian? You know, just turn it off and see who screams. Not really. I just
update your resume and turn it off.
Not a good idea.
Popcorn and watch what happens, right? Yeah.
I used to work with a facilities guy who used to say, you can do whatever you want your last day.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes that makes it your last day.
Right. That was his point in saying it. Like somebody would say, you think it's okay for me to do this? And he's like, you can do whatever you want your last day. But I was just going to say, you know, there is kind of an emerging and growing, you know, interest around resiliency in general here. I'm currently reading and planning to write a review of the book Security Chaos Engineering. Which is just all about how to actually build and sustain resiliency at all different levels. I don't know how much it gets into identities, but in general, it introduces a lot of philosophies. You know, I think a lot of it's just really changing the way that we think about things, right? Like the story of Drizzly often comes to mind when talking about this. It was a company that did alcohol deliveries that got acquired by Uber, but they had a big breach. And it was because they had an executive that they were doing a hackathon, a one-day hackathon. And for that executive to participate in the hackathon, he needed a GitHub account. You know, so they give him a GitHub account, link it to his, you know, SSO to his main account, and no MFA turned on. You know, terrible 7-character password that he reused in other places, and account never got disabled after that one-day hackathon. You know, nobody thought to put like a 24-hour timer on it, automatically shut it down after that 24 hours, or better yet still, create a throwaway account for him, you know, that you know, deletes itself after 24 hours, or, you know, give it 7 days maybe, you know. And come 3 years later, cred stuffing attack gets into Drizzly through that account, steal all the customer data. And the end of the story is the CEO of Drizzly was sanctioned by the FTC and has to do special security stuff that no other CEO has to do for the rest of his career, for the next 20 years, regardless of what company he's working for. So, you know, it kind of an incredible story that just started with an innocent hackathon, one-day hackathon, and somebody needing access to GitHub. But yeah, to wrap things up here, you know, maybe we'll, you know, for the audience, this would be a good time to get in your questions if you've been waiting to submit your questions until the end. You know, but what are the key components of a robust identity resilience strategy? Thinking about addressing both prevention and response. And let me maybe start with Chris on this one.
Well, I'm gonna first give myself a little plug and say, you know, start with some ID. I'm just kidding. We really want to think about. And
that's all we have time for.
There we go. Yeah. So we you know, I think we've touched on a lot of the things here, making sure that, you know, you're working with the right teams, right? You have all the right teams involved and you're talking about it, that your organization is making it a priority. Like I said, 1 in 3 companies right now are making identity protection their top priority. So you have to make that a priority. You have to take things seriously, like, you know, the shared accountability model when you're working with a SaaS provider. So you have to think about what are the expectations of myself and how do I go that one step further than that so that I'm ensuring that I'm covering everything, right? So, from that perspective, those are some, initial steps to start thinking about it. Then you can call Mighty ID. But I'll pass it off to Ben and let him add some perspective on this too.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, but I've got 3 components I would ensure that you have in there. And I think we've talked about all of these at some point today, but the first one is having that plan, building it out, having run books, and so on and so forth. Number 2 is having a solution in place that can help you to back up and restore your identity objects, users, groups, applications, settings, and so on and so forth. And then the third part of it is having a good way to monitor what's really happening within your identity platform, so that you can proactively respond as issues come up. Those 3 tend to be the trifecta to really achieving identity resilience.
All right, good stuff. And we do have a question in here, and just to kind of piggyback on what you both said there, Chris and Ben. It seems like a lot of it's just don't assume, that your IDP or your SaaS provider, your cloud service provider, or that other department is doing something, that's essential for you to be able to recover. I think there's a lot of assumptions that occur there, that result in this finger pointing. And maybe it's more of a cultural thing. Like I've seen organizations literally hand out the book, Extreme Ownership, to all the employees across departments. And just to, kind of try and bootstrap that shift in thinking of, somebody else probably has this covered, like not my job, not my responsibility, shift away from that to, making sure somebody is taking care of it. So the question here is, what is the best way to test a backup and recovery strategy without impacting production?
I can take a quick stab at that. One of the ways a lot of our customers do it almost on a regular basis, where they're backing up their production environment and then using it to create a test environment, using it to create a lower level environment, and actually working with it that way. And that's one of the advantages of being able to easily back up and restore or recover something like your identity platform, because then you can move it around and put it in different environments and actually test it that way without even having to do a huge BCP test. You're almost testing it daily by taking that data and restoring it in a different environment for testing, for any other type of, you certainly want to make sure you're putting it in a safe and a controlled environment, but a lower level type of environment. We've seen customers do that quite often. Ben, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I think you covered it pretty well. That's generally one of the most effective ways. Another thing we see a lot is as these processes get built out and standardized and so on, we find folks that need to use these types of processes on a regular basis, and whether it's a matter of, whoops, this user got deleted, we need a way to put them back, and therefore that makes it easy to test out that portion of it. But yeah, as Chris mentioned, having other environments to test into is a pretty significant component of it as well.
I'd say be willing to do a smaller sample size of your user database or whatever that is. You don't have to do a full 100% recovery of everything to know that it's all there. And especially in very large organizations, there's just no way to do it. So, some type of sampling, if you can do that, to do a subset and bring those over, test those, then do that on maybe a more frequent basis, more regular basis, where you're not having to do the whole thing from, beginning to end. It could take away some of the fear and trepidation of going, how in the world am I going to test this whole environment? It's just sometimes just not possible.
Scientific sampling is really beneficial. And another key component, which Adrian referred to earlier, and I'm going to expand on it, don't let this be a technical problem. Even though that's the perspective most of us come from, it's really a business issue that needs to be addressed. So engage the business throughout And that's how you have to get everyone involved and let their performance be measured on how effective that is as well. It's not simply how well can you restore a backup, how well can you punch data in there. The usability has to be there, and you have to be able to define what's critical, what's important, and what can I live without. And often that's missed in a plan like this.
I love that perspective. Communication channels and feedback loops always get you where you need to go from a business perspective. Depending on who you are, that can be difficult. Like to your point earlier, Adrian, who's that person that does that? But if you can build those communication channels with the business unit leaders and make it a full problem and not just your problem, that's a great point, Jeff. I like that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And to that point, Jeff, I've seen a disaster recovery situation where technically it was successful. They were able to flip over to the DR environment, but because the DR environment was built using all the old systems that were out of support and out of service and underpowered, it immediately fell over when the entire, full scale of all users tried to log in all at once into the DR environment. So it was a success for the first 60 seconds or so.
It's a success when you learn from it and apply the changes.
There you go. Yeah. Very, very good point. I think to wrap on. I don't think I saw any other questions here. So this looks like a good place to wrap. Really appreciate you all coming onto this webinar, sharing your stories, sharing your thoughts on this. Resilience, I think, is one of the most important things that security teams and IT teams can be thinking about and getting into the mindset with. So thanks, Chris, Ben, Jeff, and Michael for joining us today to help us better understand resilience with identities particularly. And finally, a big thanks to the audience for joining us and asking some great questions. And you're the reason why we do this. And thanks for joining.